Hi, Keith here. Welcome to Rebel Civics. We're doing a live show. Today I'm going to be joined by attorney Benjamin Shaffer of Goldback. He's an attorney deeply interested in the Constitution. I met him at the Free State Project Pork Fest in New Hampshire, the Porcupine Freedom Festival. And we started talking, and we pretty soon got well past whether shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles fit in with the Second Amendment. Of course they do. We started talking about standing armies. Maybe that's not constitutional. So I said, whoa, this is great. We should do a show on this. So he was on before. We talked about Goldback. But today we're going to talk about the Constitution, the authority, limited authority that DC is supposed to operate under, but they don't. And I go through some examples. Benjamin is cold on this. I spent about half an hour, and I probably came up with enough questions for 3 shows. But I'm just going to ask some questions and start off on some topics such as, is the FBI legal? And can the federal government really print money? And is the CIA really allowed to overthrow the dictator of another country and install a new one? Anyway, we'll start with some of them. So welcome, Benjamin. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
So I'll start with the first question. I was going to split it. I split my list into kind of external and internal actions that DC does, because external, at least there's some authority in the Constitution. They are supposed to worry about the external stuff.
You know, I think it's interesting. There's kind of 2 different approaches to the Constitution in general when it comes to whether or not something's constitutional. Or at least there's 2 different attitudes, right? There's either the attitude that the Constitution is an empowering document. It might not say everything that we can do, but it encourages us to do certain things. And then maybe we can just keep going and do more stuff beyond what it says. And then there's the far more classical view, of course, which is that it's a constraining document. The Constitution says you can only do these specific things, nothing else. You only are delegated certain specific authorities that are enumerated right here, and if we didn't say it, you can't do it, right?
And you consider that a theory? I mean, to me, that's not even a theory. The Constitution expressly delegates, as they said, certain powers. Article 1, Section 8 lists what Congress is allowed to do. That's it. I didn't even.
I know. Yeah, I definitely agree with that viewpoint.
Okay.
The Constitution is meant to constrain. The entire purpose is to constrain. That's why that's why these early American rebels, what were they trying to do? They were basically trying to get us a better Magna Carta. What was the Magna Carta originally? It was a document that says, look, even the king can't do anything he wants. The king we're going to list some stuff the king just can't do. The king has a lane. He's got to stay in his lane. And that's definitely what it is with the Constitution. We created these lanes. Some people call that the division of powers, right? With the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. So 3 branches of government. And the idea is that they each have a lane. They've got to stay in their lane. One of the ways it was described to me by one of my constitutional law professors was that everyone was imparted with certain buckets of power. There's a certain category, in other words, she called that a bucket. And then we'd say, well, what fits in this bucket? What goes with this category? And then, you write out a specific thing that a legislature can do, and you put that in the legislature's bucket of power. Okay, this is a specific role, one specific thing that's delegated to you. And so you have to keep it within that one category and pull out these specific things and say, okay, this is something I'm specifically allowed to do. And then you do that. And if it's not written down in the Constitution into that bucket of power, it's not yours. So
this was a constitutional law class that was actually about the Constitution, not what I traditionally hear constitutional law is about Supreme Court interpretations, the 3,000-page book of Supreme Court decisions, opinion, and they could care less about what the Constitution says. If anything, they might try to twist the words around, redefine what commerce means.
Arizona College of Law, and that's in Tucson, Arizona. And I really believe that, as I was in that class, I was blown away by how libertarian and how much it was about freedom, how much it was about Constitution. I thought to myself, how can any lawyer go to law school and not come out a libertarian?
I think it depends on where you go to. That's good to hear. I didn't know about that school, but I guess I'm not surprised Arizona would be that way. but most
Yeah,
aren't
I mean,
that way.
Arizona's pretty good for that kind of thing, right? So.
I spent most of my life in New Jersey. The few attorneys that I had met that studied the Constitution, by the time I was 25, I could argue circles around them.
I do think though that there were still some basic, little pink commies or something that went to law school with me, and they just kind of were like, grumble, grumble, grumble. Okay, so fine. The Constitution doesn't give them the power to do it, but who's going to stop us?
Who's going to? Well, that's a different attitude. At least somebody that says who's going to stop us is just openly admitting they don't care what it says anymore. That's right. A little easier to deal with, actually. They're being honest than pretending that the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to decide you're not allowed to grow marijuana in your own backyard for your own medical use or something.
Right.
That affects interstate commerce, right? That's their
right. Yeah, of course. That's the fun joke with the Interstate Commerce Clause was think of anything, any imaginable thing, and see if the Interstate Commerce Clause can be used to prohibit it. Doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to, growing and buying and selling things, my goodness, that's an easy leap. Interstate commerce could reach to almost anything. And then, well, actually, unfortunately, and it's a fortunate thing, there are some Supreme Court cases, because yes, we still study a lot of Supreme Court cases, where they're pointing out that maybe there are limits to the Interstate Commerce Clause to literally blanket any imaginable thing. There are a few Supreme Court decisions that push it back against that, whereas it seemed like for decades, for a century, over the last century, that interstate commerce could be used to justify literally anything.
And it still is. Yeah, thought crime could be commerce. Yeah. The example, just for people who aren't familiar with it, I think it's Rake case. That's a follow-on from the famous wheat case that started the interstate commerce abuse. But yeah, someone in California that was in a state where medical marijuana is legal, growing marijuana in her backyard or in her basement for her own medical use, small amounts. They said that that's illegal under federal law, under the Commerce Clause, because if she didn't grow it in the backyard for her own use, then she might have bought it on the market, and she might have bought it on the market interstate. It could have come from interstate. Therefore, her growing 3 pot plants in her backyard affects interstate commerce, and Congress can make it illegal. That's ludicrous. Right. The argument is ludicrous, and to hear the Supreme Court affirm that
that's literally the same argument. I wish I was better at remembering the names of every case. That's basically one of the arguments that was made about a case where a farmer grew some grain and had it in a silo and was using it on his own farm as feed. He had a bunch of corn feed. For pigs.
That was used as a precedent in the wheat case. I don't remember the name of that either, but I always just call it the wheat case.
Oh, right.
That's like the standard.
You got a little extra corn. You literally grew something. It's never even left your own property, let alone
never left this property,
let alone really entered commerce at all. But they're like,
there's no money changed hands,
commerce, which might have an effect on interstate commerce. Which means the feds can do whatever they want.
Yeah. One of the questions, since we were already on this, and I knew this was going to be a free range discussion because from our interaction at PorkFest.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Like I said, I got enough, like I said in the intro, I got enough questions here to do 3 shows with you, at least, I bet. But I was going to bring, I'll switch and do internal first, which basically the federal government has no authority in constitutionally. And just to close out our initial discussion, regular watchers of my show most are, and any that aren't listening, they're already aware that I'm taking the Jeffersonian position. Like the Constitution, from the founders' view, limits what the federal government can do. The 10th Amendment, I consider the most important one. If it's not listed as a delegated power, then it's the states or the people. So I'm even starting from there. And I'm glad you brought it up because I would have forgot to even mention that. That's where I'm starting from. Everything else I just brush off. And I have gotten into some debates with attorneys on the Constitution. I'm glad to find out about Arizona. I really only know fairly well one other attorney, maybe 2, but one of them went to Chicago School of Law, which I've heard is pretty good. Way.
For the Constitution, that's somewhat famous for that.
He's good. He's really good. I learned a lot from him. And he laughs at my typical response sometimes because there's plenty of attorneys around. I run into one and we start talking and I just say, no, that's not true. And they start telling me about their constitutional law class. And I usually say, well, you have to realize that I have a big advantage over you. And they're like, well, where did you get your law degree? I said, that's my advantage. I can just read the Constitution. It takes like an hour. I read English fine. I went to college. I mean, my degree's engineering, but that don't matter.
Right.
I can read. It takes me an hour to read it.
Then your interpretation isn't clouded by all these other interpretations, right?
Right. I don't have like 4 years of law school to overcome. That takes years and years of reading, before you can get rid of all that. Bring up, I think it was Dean Kagan of Harvard Law School that made the Constitution class optional for freshman law students. Like you can get a degree, you can get a law degree from Harvard and never have read the Constitution ever in your life. Like there's no need to do that. You can get a constitutional law degree from Harvard without ever having read it, because they don't teach that. They teach the court opinion. So anyway, I tell people that it's a joke, but it's actually kind of true. And the couple times, I think you get it, right?
That
you have to overcome
constitutional law class. Let's say you're reading a court opinion, okay? Even if you agree with that court opinion, interpreting the Constitution, they're still interpreting the Constitution. You've got to have a Constitution handy so that you can at least be like, okay, so that's what they think about this.
They should, but they don't.
Yeah,
they often don't. And I knew a couple people that went to college in New Jersey. Like, no. You don't need to know it. They know pieces of it. Like you say the Commerce Clause, they can quote it off the top of their head. And then they'll talk about the weak case or the right case and what the commerce means. So I was going to ask you the question. So here's one of the questions I had listed. I'll probably only get to 2 of these 25 questions, but I did a show recently and I got into the Department of Education, which is, and I often argue to people that are trying to fix a school, like, well, let's get rid of the Department of Education and fire everybody. And if we don't do that, like, I don't think you can fix the schools. You got to get that whole flow, those, 44,000 people or whatever it is, and all their money. You got to end all that. So when I did that, I did some research and think, like, why do they even think the Department of Education is lawful, like constitutional? Guess what? It's the Commerce Clause. They say that because of the Commerce Clause, the Department of Education can exist. What do you think of that? That was one of the questions I was going to ask. I don't even. That's a stretch.
I think that it is a stretch, but really what it comes down to is the constitutionality of the entire administrative state, right? It comes down to the New Deal and stuff like that. About 100 years ago, there was this question, like, the federal government in the Constitution doesn't have the right to create a fourth branch of government. And it's generally called the fourth branch, which is this huge administrative, state. You've got the CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations. So they're creating a form of law. You've got all these administrative agencies that are supposed to do something and take action in the United States. And it's like, well, where did any of that come from? Literally, none of that is mentioned in the Constitution. There's no Department of Education established by the Constitution. Okay, there's no DEA, there's no ATF, there's no all kinds of things. Your various 3-letter agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, most of these departments and whatnot, they have no basis whatsoever in the Constitution. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the early founding fathers didn't see some value in having more than one employee in the executive branch, right? There were some secretaries of this and that were established by George Washington so that he could have people who would help him out in using that executive power. But what it's turned into is just so huge. It's so bizarre. And yeah, there really is no constitutional authority for any of it. And what it really comes down to is that the Supreme Court, again, you were just complaining about the Supreme Court's interpretations. The Supreme Court basically decided in the 1930s, we have to do something to save the New Deal because there was huge political will for it at the time. There was a bunch, and of course, there were several judges that were just not going along because they were saying, okay, FDR, where's your authority to create this agency? Where's your authority to create all of this stuff and hire all these people to mess with people's lives in ways that you don't even have the authority to do? And FDR then, he was saying, well, if you guys on the Supreme Court, if you won't delegate me the authority by the judicial branch just saying, well, we're going to find it between the lines in the Constitution somewhere to let you have the power to do all this stuff, then I'm going to appoint a bunch more Supreme Court justices. Because another thing it doesn't say in the Constitution is it doesn't say 9 justices will sit on the Supreme Court, creating an odd number, and therefore you need at least 5 out of 9 to agree with you. These are conventions we've come up with on our own since the Constitution. He said, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pad the Supreme Court. I'm going to make it so there's 27 justices. And then I'm going to make sure that I have this litmus test before I appoint these new justices. I'm going to say, do you support my plan? Do you think the executive branch has carte blanche authority to just create new laws, create new agencies, hire all these people, create new rules? If you say no to that, then I won't appoint you, and then I'll have 27, and then I'll have 27 total justices, and only 5 or 6 that are going to vote against me. Or even if all 9 of the original 9 have voted against him, and that wouldn't have been the case historically speaking, but even if all 9 of the originals voted against me, I would still win a majority of the Supreme Court justices would be on my side, and then I'd be able to do whatever I want.
And the Senate, he thought the Senate would go along with it. Right? The Senate would have to go along, right, to confirm.
Well, and that's the thing too, is there was a great deal of political will at the time. The Senate would have gone along, and they generally knew it. So this is this is what colloquially got called the switch in time that saved 9, which is just kind of this quip that they came up with. But basically, Owen Roberts, not the same Roberts we have now, of course, that was 100 years ago. In the Parrish case, Justice Roberts decided to switch. He said he was basically one of the justices saying, I'm all this administrative stuff, there's no constitutional basis for it. I don't think that you have the power to do these things. And he changed his opinion and voted in favor of what FDR wanted. And then that basically took the pressure off of FDR using the Senate to create additional justices to get his way. Because it was like, okay, well, the Supreme Court is going to let FDR have his way now.
So he was just, he maybe even if he didn't want to do that, he thought that was better than the alternative.
He thought that was better than the alternative. He figured, look, if I don't save a 9-justice Supreme Court, then we basically lose all of our moral authority as a Supreme Court to really try to interpret anything, because then the political branch will just do whatever the heck they want to change the court's rules, to change the court's numbers, so that really we have no say at all. By
installing basically activist justices,
politicians to become justices, in which case then would we have a third branch of government? Would we have any impartiality? No, we wouldn't. All pretense of that, which I know some people, of course, some of your listeners probably don't believe exists anyway at this point, because it seems to have become so political. But his thought was, look, if I compromise and become tiny bit political for just a couple of cases, I'll retain my general overall moral authority. I'll retain my general overall ability to actually have an impartial judiciary. But of course, that's not how it works, is it?
And to change one little vote.
Beliefs, but I think that whenever you start compromising your moral authority, it's death by 1,000 cuts. A little compromise.
A little compromise for the New Deal, like one of the hugest socialist steps,
devastates your moral authority to ever come back and really have any say that matters ever again. You just can't compromise on principle. If there's a principle that's being violated, you have to stand firm on it, or there are no principles. You kind of you compromise, you step over that fence, and you find out that it's really, really, really hard or impossible to establish a new line again in the sand where you can say, yes, I have integrity again. It's like, no,
you've already seceded the moral high ground. Like you've already,
as soon as you cede,
it's done.
The moral high ground on principle, you don't regain it.
You can't come back, and that's what they did. So that's what we did. No, I never knew that story. We still have 9. That's interesting. But yeah, it's just tradition. 9. It doesn't say anything about 9. The only thing it says is you have to have a chief justice. So they could have 1.
Right.
Chris Ann Hall. Do you familiar with former prosecutor Chris Ann Hall? She does educational and constitutional stuff. Anyway, she has used the argument that I've copied often. Like she'll say, well, as far as the authority goes, like if you really want to limit the bad behavior, like kind of cut down on all this mischief the Supreme Court and the federal court system does, then shut down all the district courts, all of them, all the appeals courts, all the district courts, cut the Supreme Court down to 1 chief justice, put him in the basement of Congress with a card table and a candle and a folding chair. And that'll just cut down this problem. And that's constitutional. And that's a good idea. It's
constitutional.
That's a good idea.
But I would be concerned.
Well, yeah, and
I would be joking
because she's joking in a way, but she's the point of that is to show that Congress does have authority here. They complain about the Supreme Court and the appeals courts and the federal district courts. They're established by Congress, right? The Constitution says Congress may establish lower courts from time to time as they see fit, or something like that. I forget the wording. Now, they have control.
I would push back, though, that I think that's a terrible idea. Unfortunately,
I think it is a terrible idea, but it's an exaggeration to make the point. Go ahead and push back.
Just because something's constitutional doesn't always mean it's a good idea. Okay, so just because you have the power doesn't mean you should use that power in an irresponsible way. And maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, but I do believe that courts in general are a force for good. Courts are supposed to protect our rights. If let's say this massive overbloated executive branch decides they want to hire 1 million, 2 million enforcers who are going to go out there and brutally terrorize people in the most authoritarian, unconstitutional manner. You know, let's say they just decide that they're going to make up some kind of horrible draconian regulation that they're going to enforce on every human being with absolute brutality. Who's going to stop them? Usually it's
I think the states. If it gets to that point, the states have to stop it. I don't think the federal courts can or will stop it, because by the time the executive branch gets to that point, the court system is all on board. That's what I think would happen. To push back on your pushback.
In many cases, the courts are on board with things that I disagree with. But let's say you have it. But this comes down to, and here's some constitutional language for you. It's about redress of grievances. You've got a grievance. You've been harmed. You've been damaged. You need to have somebody you can go to and say, hey, this isn't okay. I want redress. I want to be treated fairly. This isn't right. And that is, at least theoretically, that is the purpose of courts. The purpose of courts is to be able to say, hey, something here isn't right. Someone's been hurt. Someone's aggrieved. We need to do something about this. We need to say, hey, you've got to stop that. Or you have to fix this. Right? That's the purpose of courts. And really, just because you don't always get justice in our current system doesn't mean we should give up on the concept of justice. It just means we need more justice, in my opinion. And that's really the purpose of a court. And that's why we have things like bankruptcy court, for example, established in the Constitution, that we need to have a bankruptcy court.
Well, those are state courts, right? I want to restrict this to federal courts.
In the U.S. Constitution, it says that bankruptcy is how we're going to deal with debt, because they were sick and tired of bankruptcy being used to enslave people under the British system.
Oh, so that goes to a federal court? I've never declared bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So that would go to a federal court if you declare bankruptcy?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. But,
and so, yeah, bankruptcy courts are separate from other courts because they're actually constitutional courts. They're mandated in the Constitution.
We have, I'm going to read it because I actually don't know how it came in, something called a super sticker. So I guess it's not from YouTube, but I can see the comments from the various stream links. So it's a funny
What's a
name,
super sticker?
justifiably stupid. I don't know, but we got some money from a super sticker. So that's somebody helping keep
Super.
the lights on, keep the servers running. That I work for free, that's for sure, and we're definitely not paying Benjamin. But yeah, it does cost money to do this. So thank you. She asked a question though: what's the best concept to summarize the Constitution? Federalism, separation of powers, federation of states.
Yes.
I think it's, yeah, can all three? Is that an acceptable answer? It's not an or question.
Right.
Federalism, the concept that the federal government and the state governments are separate, right? And the federal government has certain powers and states have the rest. Separation of powers, that's about the three branches. Go ahead. Yeah.
You know, I had this discussion with a guy from France, and I was like, so what makes the European Union not a country? You know, this looks like they're just recreating federalism to me. It's got all the branches, it's got all these different functions of government over its members. The members have local control like our states do, but it doesn't, but you know, you've still got this larger body, that this federation, this federalism over the top of it. Why is it that we still say that France is a country and not a constituent part of the European Union, for example? And we had this little debate about how he's like, well, you know, we don't think of it that way and we don't want it to be that way. And yeah, we know that Americans did this thing. And as we discuss the history of it and the different perspectives, I think what it really comes down to is they haven't had a civil war yet over it in Europe. And that was really their choice at Brexit. Do we fight a civil war about secession, or do we let them go? And if we let them go, then we really aren't a country. And if we force them to stay, then really there are no constituent countries within a larger union. It is one country that has constituent parts. And that's really what happened. That's how we settled it, was the Civil War.
That's how he kind of decided, or that's how he thinks of the EU then, the difference. Well,
it's like the UN or something like that. You can be a member state, but you're still a country and they're just an organization you're a member of, you know?
But the analogy is, go ahead.
I think
I was going to say the analogy is good, right? That it is a union.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. We're there's a little bit of delay here, so between when we both talk. So sorry about that for people watching. Sometimes it takes a second before I hear what he's saying. So, but if he thinks about that, and I suspect a lot of people in England do, or in EU do, but the people in England voted to leave with pretty high margin, and it was around an 80% turnout, if I remember the number right. I think it was 80%. Don't quote me on the number, but it was about that. Overwhelmingly in favor. Like it wasn't super close. And in the EU, when they wrote the original, it's their federalism set up, when they wrote their constitutional document for the EU, those guys remembered about the Civil War problem in the US, and they put a provision in. So there's a whole section about how you leave, and it's a 2-year process, and yet the country has to vote, and the vote has to be done a certain way. And they included a specific process to leave. And if the founders in 1787 had done that, like I from what I can tell and read, it didn't occur to them that they would even need to do that. Of course, a state could leave. Like it was openly talked about within a year or two of ratifying the Constitution. Like, and there was a question whether it was even going to be ratified enough to even form the Union. So of course a state could leave. They didn't even. That's my view. I don't know for sure, but I think in general, most or all the founders didn't even occur to them to write down a Brexit type process for state, because they had no problem. A state would leave. I know in at least 3 of the state ratifying conventions, there's specific language about leaving the Union if something happens. Like when they ratified it, Virginia's one, I think Massachusetts is another. I forget the third one. Might be Pennsylvania. Like if the state decides to leave, like that is in their ratifying agreement that they can leave.
And, you know, I've got a few friends here in New Hampshire. I'm in New Hampshire right now on another gold-back trip to establish
Cool.
more constitutional money in the state of New Hampshire. And there's a lot of people here who actually have some really fun arguments about how New Hampshire was established really as an independent country in 1772 with the Pine Tree Rebellion. At least some of them want to claim that and say, really, we have the right to leave. Because, and maybe we should get rid of the feds. Maybe we should stand up to them and secede. Now, that is a very minority view here in New Hampshire, but there actually was a bill. It didn't make it out of committee, I think, so it didn't get voted on in the state legislature. But there's a bill to secede from the Union in New Hampshire,
and it went to the state legislature.
Yeah, in the state legislature, though, it didn't make it out of the state legislature committees. There wasn't a general vote.
I had okay, so it didn't get past the committee. I had a very interesting conversation with one of the co-sponsors in Porkfest this year, state legislature, and also the guy, one of the guys from Maine. They were trying to get it onto the floor in Maine.
And what I tell them is, look, if you could get not just New Hampshire, but New Hampshire and Maine, and I think this would be key, New Brunswick in Canada, to all form one new union and say, we are going to be a separate country. And then who knows, maybe you could get Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia to join them. If they could get something like that going on, I think that they would have a decent shot, because Canada already has a general view that the Canadian Supreme Court actually had this question come up. Can Quebec leave the Union? Because Quebec votes on independence from time to time. And their basic rule, the Canadian Supreme Court, was you can't use violence to keep them in. If they try to leave, we're not saying that they have the right to leave, but you can't use violence to force them to stay. It's going to look pretty bad if the Canadian government says, we're going to recognize this union of New Hampshire, Maine, New Brunswick, and maybe a couple of others to be independent, but we're going to, but then the U.S. decides to use violence, right? That wouldn't fly. They'd have to negotiate, I think, if they were to create a union that was larger like that.
Yeah, I just want to tell somebody asked another question. I'll ask it in a minute when we finish this topic. But it seems pretty well understood in Canada, or at least in Quebec in general, that they do have the authority to vote to leave. Like, that's acceptable, and they've held the election. Canada, which is even more tyrannical than the U.S.
Well,
maybe
the Canadian Supreme Court did not say it was a constitutional vote. They said maybe this isn't a constitutional vote, but you can't use violence to force them to stay if they do.
You can't. Yeah, they would. So if Quebec did vote, maybe that could happen. They could happen.
Right.
And procedurally, the way the U.S. Constitution is written, the states, like New Hampshire, would have to secede from the Union, form its own country, and then it could join with another state if it wanted. Right. It would have to be done in 2 steps to be legal. That's my understanding. You agree with that? That's my understanding of how it would have to work with the U.S. Constitution. They can't decide as a state, because a state cannot make a treaty with Quebec. That's unconstitutional.
Right. Except that I think that I would argue that even if it is 2 steps, those steps can be pretty simultaneous. The moment you have seceded from the Union, and you are de facto an independent entity, then it's nobody else's business what that independent entity does, because that independent entity is independent. They can do what they choose.
It could be done as a single vote, but it would have to be done in each state separately.
Right.
And I'm counting Quebec as a state, right? I'm using the word state in the sense the founders used, which is, Virginia's a state and England's a state and Quebec's a state. But constitutionally, the way Canada works, Quebec is a province. It's not really the same.
Right. So they've got
but even then they would let it go, I think. And I've had, I think I've talked to some of my relatives. I've never lived there, but actually my last name is Bessette. My family's from Quebec City. So my heritage is Quebec, actually, even though it's 2 generations back, and I don't speak French at all. Bordeaux, I can say. But I've heard people talking about it, and like, it's accepted if Quebec did vote. Now, most people think there's too many socialists in Quebec that want money from Ottawa,
right,
so
from the larger.
that it'll never pass. It's like like hoping Puerto Rico will finally vote to become a state or leave and be its own country, like one or the other. Shit or get off the pot is what I think on that one. But so that's why I think it should happen, because, as you said about principle, secession is constitutional. Leaving the Union is constitutional for a U.S. state, and I would want to stick with it perfect and say, okay, we're going to leave, and even if it's done in one vote, we're going to leave, see who else leaves. Quebec would have to vote on the same day and Maine on the same day. I don't know if New Hampshire people would want to be part of Maine, though. That's part of the problem.
They don't have to be part of Maine. They can remain separate. They can remain
in a
separate
union
entities under a larger, new federalized system, perhaps.
Yeah. So. Texas is a good secession argument because you don't have to get into this. I have to look up the story about the pine. Would you call it the Pine Tree Rebellion?
Pine Tree Rebellion is one of my favorite stories. And actually, on their state constitutional money, the Goldback, the 50, actually depicts the Pine Tree Rebellion.
Wow, you gotta tell me more about that. Let me ask this. Yeah.
And it says an appeal to God or an appeal to heaven, because they decided they could no longer appeal to the king for justice.
So they were appealing to the Almighty.
Yep, the Almighty rather than the king. So,
which, if the people are religious, I'm not religious, but for religious people, that's a good argument. You say because God is above
higher
the
authority
king.
than the king. We don't need to follow.
Yes, you say there's a higher authority to the king. Yeah. So let me read this question. Alan, thanks again for get $10 from Justifiably Stupid. More Beverly. Here we go. We'll produce 2 more shows. Okay. The question is, what is civil rights in relation to the Constitution? I know it inspired amendments, but does it supersede only parts of it? Any parts of it? Biden wants to be remembered as the civil rights president, in my opinion. Now that's funny, the last thing. But anyway, what is civil rights in relation to the Constitution? Go.
It's tricky. This is a tricky one. So I think what it really comes down to is when we say rights, there's 2 different ways people think about it. There's negative rights and there's positive rights. Negative rights are statements about what the government cannot do. Positive rights would be about you being entitled to something. Our Constitution is only about negative rights. There are only negative rights in the Constitution. Negative rights mean constraints on government. So, for example, in the Bill of Rights, it talks about Congress shall make no law. In other words, Congress does not have the power to make a law if it touches on these things, if it does certain things, right? And so it's not about saying people shall be entitled to do whatever they want. It's that Congress can't stop them.
And it's a power.
Rights.
So it's a negative right. It's like a negative power. Would you phrase it as a negative power?
It's like a negative power. Yeah.
Power.
You specifically do not have power over this.
So the right, like freedom of the press, for example, is a right. So the people have the right of freedom of the press. And the First Amendment, the way I phrase it, it's a reminder that the right exists. So, like, as far as civil rights,
we think of it in terms of positive rights, right? Like, I have a right to report. I have a right to the press. I have the right to assembly. And so I think of it as being like,
it's a positive right.
But the way as a positive right, and maybe I do, but the Constitution isn't written that way. The way the Constitution is written is saying Congress cannot abridge it. Congress cannot interfere.
It's a negative power. So the civil right, I guess it would say, and this could be a phrasing thing. Like, I never refer to right. The government has no rights. Only people have rights. So I say, well, Congress has a power. So it's a negative power. And so I'm not sure if I'm phrasing this correctly, but like I would, and this is my terms that I'm using here, but I would say like the civil right, if you want to call it that, like freedom of speech, that's a right that people have. The negative authority is that Congress has no power, was not delegated a power to infringe on that in any way. The right to keep and bear arms, same question, same thing.
And which is interesting one too, because that delegates a lot of authority to the states, is what it primarily does. Whereas, you know, freedoms of speech and so forth are delegated more to the people. But yeah, so this is the big question with civil rights. Okay, is that when we think about the Civil Rights Act, okay, and we think about civil rights, originally that term civil rights was about these negative powers, about these negative rights, that no one could interfere with it. Therefore, you, in your civil life, you're simply empowered to do whatever you're going to do. The Civil Rights Act kind of took more of a positive rights view, that because you have dignity as a person, and this is how Oberbefell was decided too, was this idea of the dignity of the person, the independence of and powers within a person, means that you're entitled to have to certain things.
And that was Oberfeld as the marriage case.
Yes, Oberbefell is the marriage case,
sex marriage case for
same-sex
gay
marriage,
same-sex marriage. Yes, just for people that don't know the name. Yeah, that's like, yeah, that's bogus. That's a bogus Supreme Court. That's a funny one to read. Like, you can't tell us. Like Congress, if you tried to present that to Thomas Jefferson, that taxpayers were going to pay the Supreme Court to decide what marriage is, he would have been like, "What? We screwed up somewhere." What do you mean? Where do we screw that up? I didn't know we need to write that one down. Like, no.
Yeah.
Actually, I think most of those guys would say marriage is, again, I'm an atheist, but religious people would say marriage is between you and God, right? Like, that's not a state
question. How did the government get involved anyway from a constitutional perspective, right? Because there was no such thing as marriage licenses at all. The government literally had no role whatsoever during the times the Constitution was written.
No, not even the local government.
Not even the local government.
Let alone the federal government.
It wasn't the government's business.
No, marriage is, and I still don't consider it the government's business, although I did get a marriage license at one time.
See, this is one of the things that I
went along.
This is exactly what I usually say: is stop delegating them powers they don't have. Just don't play along. I've gotten myself in trouble for this with a few people by expressing this opinion and making people feel like, hey, they didn't like my attitude. But really, especially when it comes to marriage, don't get a license. You can have a huge, beautiful ceremony. You can have a religious belief about it. You can have a non-religious belief about it. You can have a party with your friends and family. You can kiss under a canopy. You can share a glass of wine. You can do all kinds of things. Nowhere in any of that does it require you to involve the state. So just don't. Like, there's no reason for you to choose to involve the state when you don't need to. So, yeah, my advice to couples getting married is just don't invite them. Just don't get the license.
I wouldn't do it again. I'm no longer married, and that was also state approved. But so I guess there's always the been there, done that thing. So, but just say I did it again. I do happen to live with an awesome girl. Maybe it could happen. I don't know. But you remember Renata, right? But so if I did it again, that's a good argument. Like, why would we involve the state?
I don't want to invite them.
I don't need to invite them. We don't need to change names. When I got married before, my wife,
without the marriage license, you can still.
Oh, that's true. You don't need it for that reason.
Change my name.
When I got married, my wife was also an engineer who had started her career, and she didn't change her name. We talked about it. She said she would if we wanted to, but like, no, we were, late 20s at the time, and it's almost like it's too late, and we didn't have children, so that would be one reason to do it. I think I would do it for that reason. Yeah, that would be a key reason to do it.
You can do that,
but you can do that anyway. Good point.
Pretty much every power that is done by statute can be done by contract, and that's a free exchange between free people, is to create a contract rather than have it imposed by some statute. But when it comes to civil rights, I think this is really the hard question: is do you believe in positive rights or not? And if you don't believe in positive rights, if you believe that negative rights are the only thing that the government can do, which is stay out of your business,
negative power. I wanted to make sure I understand what you mean. What I call negative powers.
Yeah, like negative powers. If
Okay.
that's the kind of rights you believe in, is that the government simply has negative powers that they can't infringe, and that you have freedom,
You have positive
then
rights.
then that's the more constitutional view, frankly.
Is
But the much more popular view now, it's becoming very popular, is this idea of positive rights, that you're entitled to certain treatment.
like you have a right to education, you have a right to
Sure.
housing, you
Right to
have
housing, right to healthcare, things like that.
I usually will push back. People start talking about women's rights, gay rights, all kinds of stuff. And I say, well, if you have to put a word in front of it, then you already know you're not talking about it right. Like there's no such thing as women's rights. There can't be. It's impossible.
You're talking about positive rights then, because you're talking about entitlements.
So that's a good way to put it.
Rights.
I didn't know the wording for that, but yeah. So that's the way I always put it, is like, no, you can't. If it's a thing that you're calling a right, but it's limited to this group, like women or homosexuals or something, like, no, you're not talking about a right then, because either everybody has it or it's not a right. There's only two possibilities. So that's what I mean. And I don't hate women, although that's what will happen if you say that on Twitter.
If you say there's no such thing as women's rights, then you're like, oh, so you want to enslave women or something.
Yeah, and I know all you Trump voters hate women. I'm like, whoa, what? What? But that's the response you'll get. How much money did you donate to the Trump campaign?
None.
None. Actually, none is the answer. Sometimes I'll string people along and then say, I didn't vote for Trump either time. And it often throws people for a loop. But anyway, because I'm making a point about rights or constitution or something.
Think that everything has to be a dichotomy. It's either Democrat or Republican. It's either you're on my side or you're not on my side. You're in or you're out. You're us or you're them.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of thinking is just it's myopic and it's dangerous.
So my, like I said, maybe I'll get you back for another episode in a couple months. I think I only asked one of about 20 questions here.
Really? Sorry.
Yeah. No, I didn't know where this was going to go. And I didn't, this preparing for an episode like this, I knew it's like the theory is, okay, I'm going to sit down. I spent maybe half an hour and like came back this morning and spent 15 more minutes and wrote a couple more things. I'm like, well, did I prepare enough? It's like, I'm kind of prepared for my whole life for these questions have been building and I've been thinking about them. But the internal, so we talked quite a bit about the internal. So I agree with you. Most of the agency things, the FBI, Department of Education, like the FBI, does the federal government have authority to have a police force that operates within each state doing police actions?
Police powers are explicitly delegated to the states. Police powers belong to the states, not the federal government. So there really shouldn't be federal police.
Everything the FBI does is unconstitutional by definition.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and don't forget, it wasn't until J. Edgar Hoover we even had an FBI.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like a lot of times we think that certain fixtures, just because we've gotten used to them, are the way everything has to be. And if you pull that card out, the whole house of cards will come falling down. It's essential. It's a foundation of our society. And it's like, no, it's not. I mean, like, heck, I'm not even very old yet, and yet I'm older than credit scores. Credit scores didn't used to be a thing. Well, we could abolish that, and the entire system wouldn't fall apart.
Yeah, we're all, a lot of these things that people think have been around forever. I'm older than the Department of Education. Like, people got educated before the Department of Education. Like, I think I remember when that was formed. I'm pretty old, but yeah, it seemed to be okay. I mean, they changed a lot of things, but yeah. So the FBI is a good one, and I wouldn't argue that there's nothing the FBI does that's useful. There probably is a few things here and there. Mm-hmm. So my view is that anybody that's working for the FBI right now, they should jump at the chance to get away from DC and work to the state. So maybe there's a few things the FBI is doing out in the states, transfer that to the states. Just give it all to them. Say, here, these agents, all these resources, here's the equipment. That's all yours, and just shut the whole thing down. That's following the Constitution. The NIH, I would throw in there. That's a fun one to talk about now. Does the NIAID, the National Institute for Infectious Disease, the Fauci created, his dream group, and managed to dole out about $1 trillion over his career.
That's a lot of money.
All of that's unconstitutional. Like the federal government isn't supposed to have anything to do with healthcare, let alone regulating drugs and deciding which drugs are allowed to go to market, or by the way, creating a virus out of bat coronaviruses, enhancing functions. Like, none of that's constitutional. Like, that would have solved the problem if we just said, no, the NIH can't exist. And Fauci.
And it's amazing how often when we think about government overspending, our concern is inflation. Our concern is they're wasting my money. We're not, if it was just waste, it wouldn't be so bad. It's so much worse than waste. They're spending this money to harm you.
Yeah, doing nothing would be better.
Literally just burning the money would be better.
Yeah.
Literally just padding the pockets of corrupt cronies and buddies and friends so they can buy fancy resorts and just waste our money would be better. They're actually spending money in copious amounts, in many cases, to harm us, to take away our rights, to violate our constitutional rights.
It would be a vast improvement if we just sent $4 trillion a year to DC and they didn't do anything except party.
Right, and just be like,
that would be great.
That'd be great. Have a great time. Just buy houses for all your friends.
Buy houses. Don't start any new wars.
Just spend it all on
buy
yourselves.
Houses for your friends, rather than say trying to start a nuclear war with Russia.
Right.
Just buy houses for all your friends and family. That would be better.
Yeah,
I would go for that.
That'd be so corrupt, and it's like, yeah, but it would still be better.
Well, it is corrupt. Yeah. If somebody says, well, that would be so corrupt, then you're like, well, yeah, but it is corrupt. Like, what are you saying? Right. You can't live in a dream world. You say, like, here's what you're presented with. What would be better? Shut it down. Like, whenever they vote to shut down the government, like, yeah, they're shutting down the government. Cool. Hope they shut it down for 6 months. Works for me. After 6 months, we'll check back in and see if there's anything they didn't do that we need. That'd be a good experiment to run. I never mind when the budget fails and they shut down. All right, so that's internal. So the somebody commented, giving money and weapons to Ukraine is good for the economy, more jobs. I assume they need a hashtag sarcasm. It is jobs.
Well, jobs but isn't the same thing as benefit.
It has the unfortunate problem of they might start a nuclear war and wipe the top 2 miles off the face of the earth. But other than that risk, yeah, there's some jobs. And hey, I worked for a defense contractor for a while. But yeah, hashtag sarcasm, right?
One of the reasons why the Constitution might not be perfect, but it makes so much more sense if we limited ourselves, kept ourselves within bounds, knew where the rules were, and stopped crossing the line all the time. Because really, the greatest destructions, the greatest problems in the world are usually happen when somebody, maybe with good intentions, crosses some line, compromises some boundary or principle.
I push it on this show. It is one of the purposes of this show. Besides calling out overreaching government, the Constitution is pretty good. It could have been better, obviously. The Lysander Spooner argument, either it authorized what we have now or it did nothing to prevent it. Yeah, he's right.
Right.
But it's because we have to do, the people and the states have to stop it. The federal government's not going to limit itself. And we got 250 years of history to prove that. I don't think it. I spent 2 years working with the Convention of States about changing it, and then I realized that this isn't going to help either. So what I talk about on this show, and we've been going for 6 months now, I think the Constitution is pretty good, and if you understand it from the founders' point of view and followed it, it wouldn't fix everything, but it would fix a lot of what's wrong with DC. And I'm totally in favor of limiting DC by whatever method possible. If people want to change the Constitution, I don't argue with them. I don't think it'll help all that much, but because it's abused anyway. They'll just
the main, like you're saying, like the purpose of this show, the main thing is to get people to understand it a little better, to learn something about it. I was just this week in Dover, New Hampshire, and one of the state reps came in. They saw the Goldbacks, and she said to me, "Wait a second, states can't make gold money." And I said, "Well, yes, they can. Of course they can." She said, "No, it's prohibited in the Constitution." Where does it say in the Constitution that a state can make gold money? And I said, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. And she just looked at me like, "What? You can quote me the thing?" And I said, "Yeah." And I quote, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin of tender in payment of debts."
Yeah. And very good. You know, I was about to read it. I have my little.
Yeah, she was blown away.
Yeah.
She was blown away. And here she is this in the state legislature, but she didn't understand what powers were delegated and prohibited to the states. And one of them is they can make gold money.
And she's in the New Hampshire state legislature, where there's probably 100 people that explain that to her. Right. All those free state people could tell her that one. They all know that.
Yeah. And I thought she was just a little bit like, "Oh, dang it. He knows."
He knows, yeah. Oopsie. It's actually the opposite. A strict interpretation of that is they're not allowed to use fiat dollars, right?
Right.
No state shall use anything other than gold and silver.
States have to use gold or silver.
They have to use gold or silver.
But it never said the feds couldn't create a whole other thing that's not mentioned in the Constitution, delegate it to a private bank, and let them run amok.
And you're just they're going down the path where they don't understand how the Constitution works. The number one thing as we started is that the Constitution lists what the federal government's allowed to do, not the other way around.
Right. And nowhere in there does it say you can give the power to international bankers to create fiat money and hold your entire economy hostage with their own private for their own private benefit. Nowhere does it say that, and that's what we've done.
Doesn't say that anywhere. Let's see if there are any other comments on it before I go on. Somebody said the only reason for tax breaks, like marriage, you're talking about, is with children. But that's a question. Is like
you can claim your children.
Asking for you can claim your children.
Yeah.
What does it mean to claim you're married? I mean, I'm married. If you're married in your heart, are you married? If you're religious and you're married in God's eyes, are you married? What's the IRS have to say about that?
If you're claiming tax benefits of being married, as in married filing jointly, then yeah, they want you to have a marriage license. But there's so many other ways to get similar benefits. And in some cases, actually in quite a few cases, you're actually better off unmarried.
For tax reasons.
For tax reasons. Yeah.
It used to be a big marriage penalty. I remember when I first started working full time and was married. It was better to file separate. But that changed. I don't remember exactly when, in the 90s maybe. That changed, and I used to do the taxes both ways and see. And it changed so it actually didn't matter, and then it was slightly better. Mostly it didn't matter if you have similar income, within a couple factor of 2 or 3 or something like that.
I think
it only matters if one person has a lot of income and the other one has none. Then it matters.
Well, and here's another thing, though. You can claim a dependent without being married to them. If you have a lot of income and they have none, you can claim them as a dependent.
Anyway. Oh, they have to be it doesn't matter what age they are.
Doesn't matter what age they are. They don't have to be handicapped or something. They just have to receive more than 50% of their support. So,
and that's the same with children. So you don't need to be married to claim children on federal income tax. I don't know all the states. I specifically moved to one that doesn't have income tax, so I don't have to think about that anymore.
When we get deep down in the weeds on this, there can be benefits to marriage legally. There can be things that statutorily are conferred upon married couples that you can't get by contract. There's not very many. Most of them you can do without it. But there are a few. And when you run into those, all you've got to do is then get married if you need to legally. I mean, like, you can get married according to your faith or according to your tradition or according to your community, and then just put it off. And then if you do run into one of those situations, like actually under statute, there's a major benefit to you to be married, then go ahead and go down to the justice of the peace then.
Yeah, go and get married if you find that there is a reason. Yeah, I've lived with the woman I did marry. We lived together. We bought a house. We lived together for a long time. What happened with us was we got to the point where we were going to be what do they call it when you're married by default? Like you wake up one day and you're
common
married.
law marriage, maybe?
Common law. Yeah, we were getting within like 6 months. We were going to be common law marrying. Like, well, I ain't doing this accidentally.
That depends
so
on
we
the
should
state.
just do it.
Some states don't even have.
We should just do it on purpose. And I think most of them have dropped it since then. Yeah. But yeah, we were nearing that point and we got married. But I still have to say, I mean, and this is, I don't want to get into personal stuff, but I did feel slightly different. Like it is a commitment. So even though the state's involved, and I hate that part of it, I would do the ceremony. I probably would do what you're talking again. If I did it again, I would do the ceremony with my friends and family, and you make the commitment. And I think the way that I felt after I got married, it would happen again. And hell with the state. I don't need the government to sanction it or reject it, or like, I don't want anything. And then I would just live as a married person.
Yeah, and you would be married, and you could claim that you were married, right?
I would claim that I was married.
Your customary.
Yeah. I mean, it's not immoral to lie on your tax return. Taxation is theft. It's like, it's not immoral if a raper knocks on your door and says, "Is your daughter home?" and you say, "No, she's not home." Like that's not an immoral lie.
You know, if you're telling the Nazis that no, there's no Jews in my basement,
no Jews in my basement,
that you have to feel bad about.
No, that's you're under force, right? You're under duress. Yeah. You're under force. So the Nazi is initiating force in that case. So the lie is not a moral question. Even though I have gotten into arguments with some hardcore Christians will push back about that. You can't lie. But to me, that you're under force. Yes. Being too absolute. You're actually compromising the principle. So the principle that I would start with is that no one is allowed to initiate force. Can't initiate force on another person. Like, that's where it starts. So this idea of lying, the question is, are you initiating force by saying something that is not actually the truth?
In theory, that's the purpose of constitutional law. That's the purpose of the Supreme Court. When two principles or two laws or two rights come into conflict with each other, somebody has to say, okay, what supersedes here? What's the appropriate action when two things come in conflict?
When you look at the principle and somebody does something and they bring it before the court, like, and right. So they should be looking at, like, if we switch to external. So I did want to at least touch on some external things, because like I said in the beginning, external is a little more interesting because there are a bunch of things that the federal government was delegated a power to do related to external, like treaties and defense, conduct wars and all that. But they weren't authorized to do all these adventures. Like, for rhetorical example, not to say I know what happened, but is the Pentagon authorized to blow up pipelines, say, for just example, because they think it'll help something they want to do? Like, no, right? They can't initiate force without a declaration of war.
Right, and I think that's the thing that's really been hard. Is how long has it been? It was World War II or something. It was the last time we actually declared war. Ever since then, we just have an executive branch that's assuming that they can get away with it, and they just continue to do stuff. And even an authorization of force type of bill from Congress doesn't make much sense, because it should be war, specifically declared war. And those authorizations then, of course, are used to be so broad. I mean, this is where I really got mad at Bush, and I'm still mad at Bush. The second one was that
both of them,
but the second one especially, because that authorization of force is so open-ended that it covers everything, including the extrajudicial killing of American citizens by drone strike, which Obama did.
Yeah,
under that same authorization. It's like, well, it's only one step further before they start saying we're going to extrajudicially execute Americans on American soil. Like, wait a second, what difference does it make that it wasn't American soil? And
well, they have to.
It's a very dangerous, slippery slope. And slippery slope is usually a fallacy, right? It's a slippery slope fallacy that things have to go bad because you took one step that other steps will necessarily follow. In this case, this is not a fallacy because I'm not talking about future slippery slopes. I'm talking about past ones. We already did one thing that already cascaded into a bunch of other crazy, crazy stuff all around the world that's already slipped way further down that slope than they even thought was possible when they started. And that's just in the past. That's not the future. I mean, who knows how much further we could slip. That might be a fallacy for me to argue that we're going to slip even further. Maybe we'll stop now. But we've got a lot of momentum behind us, and there's no sign of it slowing down. And it's already been a slippery slope.
They're showing no signs. They're showing the opposite right now with the, basically it's a proxy war with Russia.
Yeah, it already is.
With Ukraine, like, you could say, well, are we at war with Russia? Well, Congress didn't declare war, but we've been at war with Russia as a proxy since at least 2014 that I know of, when the CIA orchestrated the coup and the U.S. State Department handpicked the new president for Ukraine, and then they started talking about joining NATO, and like that war has been going on since at least 2014. Syria.
Even in Syria,
Lebanon.
there was and both sides are just toying with the edges of it. I mean, Putin also doesn't want to be an open, direct war with the United States. So they had things where they got all the Russian soldiers to take off their insignia.
Oh, I didn't know.
Before they attacked the Americans. And so like that, so they could say, "Oh, they're just Syrians, or they're just people in Syria."
Oh, in Syria, yeah.
It's not Russian soldiers fighting American soldiers. It's non-specified combatants fighting
non-specified they're terrorists,
They're
so now it's in the war on terrorism, the war on whatever, you can pick. And yeah, they got all drummed up that, it brings up and the CIA is involved. So the CIA kind of gets in there and gets started with it. And then the Pentagon comes in and using the authorization for use of force. It's ludicrous. I try to laugh at it because it's so far off from what they intended, which is that the executive does not have the authority to decide when to go to war and when to stop going to war, because they saw that in 500 years of English history with the kings. Like, the kings had the power to decide when to go to war, who to go to war with, and when to end the war. And they also conducted the war, and that's a conflict of interest, and that doesn't work. That's why they separated it. Like, that's a good idea. We should stick to that one. World War II was the last legal war. But the proxy, would you call what we're doing right now a war?
I would. In fact,
I do.
We're definitely at war with Russia. The question is will it stay somewhat localized? Will it stay small scale? And I don't know why a declaration of war, which would have been the constitutional way to do it, I don't see why that would have necessarily necessitated that it be on a larger scale than what we're doing now. Right? You could have Congress declare war and have us limit that war to a couple of specific objectives or specific battlefield. I don't see why that necessarily is a slippery slope.
Well, the problem is their goal is regime change in Russia, and Putin is not going to tolerate that one.
Roll over.
When Ukraine membership in NATO, so they want to keep missiles that are capable of firing missile launchers that are capable of firing nuclear weapons, but loaded with anti-aircraft weapons within a few minutes flight time of Moscow.
So of course they're nervous.
They're nervous, yes.
Of course they're nervous.
I mean, it's an easy analogy to make would be you could just pick Canada or something. Like, what would happen if Russia went into Ottawa, organized the KGB or I don't know what their secret service is called since the Soviet Union broke up, but they organized a coup. The State Department from Moscow handpicked a new president for Canada, gave him a couple $2 billion, and then Canada became super pro-Russia, and then Russia installed missile batteries capable of firing nuclear missiles that could hit DC all on the border. Like, I don't
Right.
think DC, I think we wouldn't tolerate that.
I think we'd be pretty nervous, wouldn't we?
Yeah. And I'm not, believe me, I'm not justifying what Putin did. At least going past the Donbass region and Crimea. But yeah, I think you have to look at what your enemy is saying. He's saying, like, I don't want NATO line to move further east, right? You can go all the way back to Gorbachev. When they agreed with Gorbachev, we would never move it further east than Berlin, than where it was at the end of World War II. NATO would not expand to Russia. Now NATO's on Russia's border. Of course they're worried.
Right. And, this brings up the larger principle. I like to bring these things back to the principle of the thing. And that is, are we going to be true to our commitments? Are we trustworthy? Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, the United States has a long history of promising things that we do not follow through on. Think about treaty rights with Native Americans. Think about, we're always sucker punching somebody, and so that the part of the problem is that if we don't learn to be more trustworthy, of course, we're not going to be trusted,
And you can't trust him. Who was it? I forget who was it that met with Gorbachev. I think it was Kennedy. Or the Secretary of State at the time. They promised not to move the NATO line verbally, and there was letters back and forth. And every president since then has done it, has moved it. Every single one.
Yeah.
Well, G-Man, this is somebody that
power in this country, and that's part of the issue too, right? Is that unless you make something a treaty, then the next administration has no motive whatsoever to honor the past administration's promises. And honestly, even then, we're pretty loose with our treaties.
G-Man commented, "I'm already nervous about Canada."
Those scary Canadians.
Yeah, they're with Trudeau. Trudeau running. Really worry about. Yeah, so it's all unconstitutional. Like they just to summarize, they made this rule in the Constitution that Congress had to declare war, and then the president really becomes commander in chief after Congress declares war. He can't decide to send troops,
And yet we have these,
unless we're invaded, and then that's only until you can assemble Congress. Right? Even in the days of Pearl Harbor, like what was transportation like then, it only took 3 days to declare war on Japan. Like it can happen pretty quick.
The danger, and of course the danger of this never-ending war, the forever wars, some people call them, is that it basically creates a fascistic state. Right? It creates a police state. The police become more militarized. The military becomes more of a police force. And it just never stops. And if you don't stop and you reset and you say, okay, this is peacetime, and peacetime means that we're going to respect our rights, and we're going to demilitarize the police, and we're not going to treat human beings as targets and enemies. We're going to treat them as fellow citizens. Then things just kind of continue down that path, and that's what really makes a fascistic state is using war as a tool to unite your people into a never-ending cycle of essentially increasing the power of the elite.
Yeah, it's Orwellian. We have always been at war with Russia, with Eurasia.
We kind of have been at war with them. Yeah.
They've been trying to stir that one back up. The people that were really pissed when Russia broke up. They're still trying to. They hope they can stir that one back up. The government needs a boogeyman. That's how they get their money and power.
Now, you and I have discussed this before, but I want to bring up something interesting that I think the Founding Fathers had in mind when they were concerned about a police state, when they were concerned about standing armies. And they talked a lot about standing armies in the Federalist Papers and so forth, the Anti-Federalist Papers. And I believe that the Second Amendment was meant to remedy this. And yet, according to what they actually wrote about it, the way they interpreted it. But the Second Amendment has not been interpreted that way in a very long time. So what is the Second Amendment, right? The Second Amendment says that militias are necessary for the maintenance of a free state. And therefore, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So most notably missing is the word gun. The word gun does not appear in the Second Amendment.
Well, arms is what they use, right? which is
Right.
anything a man can carry or useth to strike out or at another.
Well, and yet
That's
arms,
the legal
I would
definition.
say, has generally had an even larger definition, which means weapons, weaponry, or tools of war, or arms. But yes, you're right. Very classically, it's something you could carry in your arms, right? But what kind of weapons did they? I mean, war machines might have existed before that, and so maybe they didn't think of those as arms.
Canon apply, right? But I use that arms definition because it's from the a legal dictionary from the 1700s. I pretty much quoted, probably not exactly. I found that it's easier to argue with people that don't even think you should be allowed to have a semi-automatic to at least use like, well, this is what they meant at the time. That's what arms is. So like, don't tell me about guns. Like they certainly meant anything a military officer could carry. They certainly meant automatic weapons, like, of course.
But the
thing I remember this. I was going to bring this topic up, by the way. I was going to close with it because I thought we would go on for a long time. And I just, like, I vividly remember the first time I met you, at the first time I talked to you at PorcFest, and I actually went there to buy some goldbacks. But I forget how the Second Amendment came up, and you said you were an attorney, deeply interested in the Constitution. So I said, oh, well, do you consider shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles to be covered by the Second Amendment? And you were like, absolutely. Like, that's not a question or something like that. I'm like, oh, okay, now I know where we're starting from. And then we started talking about standing armies. And I was like, wow, I've never actually heard this argument about the Second Amendment. That the Second Amendment is actually intended to not have standing armies. You don't need a standing army. And that's, if you remember, that's when I stopped you and I told you about Rebel Civics, like, oh, I want to have you on and continue this. So let's go. Yeah, standing armies are unconstitutional. And we have $1 trillion standing army right now, roughly.
Yeah. I would argue trillions, plural trillions, you know.
What trillion a year? 900 billion, I think, roughly for next year.
Yeah, but that's per year. That adds up.
Oh, yeah, yeah. What I meant is per year.
Yeah, it's crazy how expensive, how much we spend on this, and defense spending in general is just out of control. and so the U.S. Constitution does give the federal government the power to coordinate the efforts of the states. But there used to be something called a militia, which was now called the National Guard. Again, they were trying to get away from the original model. The original model is that each state has its own militia. And then they tried to nationalize it. So they wanted to call it the National Guard. But even to today, the governors of individual states can mobilize their National Guard. Okay? Because what they are is they're state militias. And the founding fathers were really worried about this standing army business. They were like, well, we might need to coordinate. Right now, of course, when they made the Constitution, they were right with the Revolutionary War and all of that. They had just become keenly aware that we needed to coordinate our efforts. We needed to have not just the New Hampshire Army and the Virginia Army do their own thing, but we had to have, even though the New Hampshire had their own regulars and Virginia had their own regulars, we had to make sure that they could coordinate their efforts. And so coordinating their efforts became the thing that the federal government's job was to do, was to say, okay, in time of war, it specifically says in time of war, they are to coordinate the common defense, is the term, the common defense. And yet there was a lot of people really worried about standing armies. And this is how you get some of the rules that says, for example, that the military cannot be used as a domestic police force, is still some of the, and that is mostly honored.
Sort of, except they now use the National Guard for that. And I would argue the National Guard has become part of the military.
Right. So these lines have gotten very, very blurred. But the original idea was that, the same reason why we don't appreciate it when King George sends a bunch of military officers ostensibly into his own country, if he claims that we're part of his country, to harass and to oppress his own citizens. We don't like this. We don't want to do that. We don't want to recreate the same problem that we're fighting against. And so there's lots of talk about how standing armies are absolutely anathema to a free state. And so this was the question, and this is the context I'm building up because of the way they talked about it in these letters, was that you cannot have a free state while there are standing armies. And then, wouldn't you know it, that's what the language that you see in this Second Amendment. So I'm going to read Second Amendment text again. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We mostly focus on the second half. It's the first half that I'm really interested in here because, first of all, militias need to exist. They can be well-regulated, and but what are they? They're necessary to secure the freedom of the state, a free state, right? And so this constitutional debate about standing armies was really about how do we maintain our freedom? How do we prevent this kind of tyranny? And so that if there was in times of peace, in peacetime, there must not be a standing army. In other words, there cannot be a permanent military. There cannot be a U.S. Army or a U.S. Navy or a U.S. Air Force. And they can't just exist all the time. They have to not exist in times of peace. So what do we do about a common defense? How do we make sure that we're safe? And the solution, I would argue, that the Founding Fathers had in mind was the Second Amendment, was their solution to standing armies. And so they said, well, I guess that means we'll have to have the local militias, the state militias. In other words, it's under state control of individual states. And that's necessary for the freedom of those states. They can regulate that militia within their state. In other words, at a state law level. And in order to have a free militia in each state, the people have to be able to have the arms. Who owns the weapons is basically who owns the weapons and how are they used was the question they were trying to answer. And so they said, okay, we're not going to have a standing army at the federal level. We're going to have militias at the state level that are regulated by the states. And then we're also going to divide that power further amongst the people. So the federal government will have the power. So what they were trying to do is this division of powers, right? You've got three parties that they had in mind. You have the federal government, the state government, and the people. And those three entities would each have a role to play. The federal government would coordinate the common defense by coordinating the state militias, which would be regulated at the state law level. But the actual ownership of the weapons would belong to the people. Now, I realize things have gotten far more complicated since that time. Shoulder-mounted anti-tank missiles, the Lance type systems that you mentioned, notwithstanding, things are way more complicated even than that. We do have nuclear weapons and things like that. I don't know that the Founding Fathers would necessarily feel the same way about the people owning all arms, all weapons, when you consider that that is
with mass destruction,
right? So I'm not necessarily trying to make an argument that we have to go back entirely to exactly the constitutional model, but I think the constitutional model should be informing what we think about. All weapons should be owned by the people. Every weapon should be owned by a human, not an institution. And the states should be able to set the laws and regulations about how their own state militia, therefore they're a branch of the National Guard, every state, every governor should be the only actual commander-in-chief in peacetime. Of the actual state should have its own militaries. And the federal government's job should be to coordinate them in time of war.
So the federal government it's an administrative job, basically.
Yeah.
And then the president becomes commander-in-chief when war is declared.
Right. And yeah, you can have high generals, in the Department of War, which has been just the most brilliant rebranding in history. It's now called the Department of Defense instead of the Department of War. But the Department of War could have its generals who would have, and it can be well regulated. So the states probably should be participating in joint exercises where the federal government has common defense plans at all times, certainly. But the federal government shouldn't actually command or own the troops.
That there'd be state level. So for more complicated things, it would be in the state.
Right.
Well, some of the weapons there, I'm pulling this thread through. I like it. Like, as far as personally owned. So as the complicated weapons get bigger, anybody in South Florida wants to go in on an M1 Abrams tank that has parking, count me in. Hit me up on PM.
Nice.
But when you get up to, say, an Aegis destroyer, maybe we don't need them. Like, one of the things you could think about nuclear weapons is, well, if we weren't doing all this stuff worldwide, we wouldn't need any nuclear weapons. Like, Switzerland doesn't need nuclear weapons.
I'm a bit of a pacifist in my personal beliefs, and honestly, I think that the world would be a safer place if we unilaterally disarmed our nuclear weapons. We have enough other types of weapons to be a deterrent, in my opinion. I think that nuclear weapons don't make us safer. I think they make everyone in greater danger. It puts us closer to the edge of the U.S. and Russia creating mass destruction worldwide. I think we can put a great deal of pressure on other nuclear powers to disarm, and we'd have more moral authority to do so if we disarmed first. We still have a lot of conventional weaponry that could act as a very serious deterrent, even if we disarmed our nuclear arsenal. But yeah, here's the other thing too, though, that a lot of Second Amendment fans are not going to thank me for, in my theory on this, is that the state does have the power to make its militia well regulated. And so that could mean that an individual is not allowed to own a sidearm or a gun unless they follow certain regulations.
The Second Amendment proponents will push back on that, because Second Amendment proponents are big government fans. They love big government. They want the federal government to manage everything.
Not always, but sometimes, yeah.
So if you say to them,
in Florida,
if you explain
to getting the Abrams tank, right? Florida could decide how Abrams tanks are handled, where they are stored, things like that for its common defense. And I would say that your state government does have the authority, by the Constitution at least, has the authority to regulate where those tanks are and how they're used and who owns them, really, frankly, because it needs to be for the benefit of a free state. But so if you're living in a state that's not very freedom-minded, they may regulate this in ways that we wouldn't like. But
I'm totally on board with that. I use that. I often get Second Amendment fans to agree, but not always. I happen to be in Florida, which is a good one to argue, because now if we're talking with a Florida resident, they start arguing about the Second Amendment and like, well, yeah, the 1934 Firearms Act is unconstitutional. Like, sure. But you want to talk about Florida as far as whether you can say concealed carry without a permit. We should be talking about the Florida Constitution. Like, don't even call DC, call Tallahassee. Florida Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, except that the legislature may regulate the manner in which firearms are carried. Something like that. I'm not quoting exactly, but there's an exception in there. So people that want to argue for permitless carry say, well, you need to change the Florida Constitution. No, you don't. Second Amendment says you could carry, right? That's a typical response. Like, actually, the Second Amendment is not even relative to this. Congress doesn't require a concealed carry permit in Florida. So we're talking about concealed carry. And the Florida state constitution currently allows the legislature to require a permit. Now, in Florida, it takes about a half hour to get it.
This is part of the mental tyranny that too many people fall into, is that we look to the federal government too much. We just look to them too much to solve our problems. We look to the federal government too much as our source of authority or our expectations. I've read the U.S. Constitution. We promote that. We pass out pocket constitutions. How many people have a pocket state constitution? And yet that's frankly where a lot of our rights should be deriving from. And yet a lot of people, it's hard enough to get people to read the federal Constitution Everyone should read their own state constitution. Your state has the power to give rights, or these negative rights, right? It has the power to recognize or infringe on rights that the federal government hasn't even contemplated, or the federal constitution doesn't even mention. A lot of your rights are in your state constitution, where the state says, yeah, the federal government delegated to the states certain powers, but we are going to constrain the state government in certain ways so that the state government can't infringe your rights. That's really important.
I agree, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I tried to push that idea because, I used to live in New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the few states that has no right to bear arms in its constitution. There's no right to keep and bear arms in the state, and it's very hard to buy a gun. I tried when I was working there. I worked in Camden, which had the highest murder rate per capita in the U.S. for a small city, and I was in my 20s when I moved there and got a job, and I naively thought I should probably get a gun, because I used to work late a lot, and I come out in Camden, downtown Camden, bad neighborhood. I came out of work at like 10 o'clock one night, and I was on my motorcycle, and there's a guy about 30 feet from my bike, pulls up in this old beat up car, and he goes out in his trunk and he pulls out 2 handguns and he sticks them behind in his pants, pulls his shirt down. He looks at me, he gives me a long look, and then he turns around, he starts walking over the side of my building. Like, all right. So I thought maybe I should get a gun. I don't know. I didn't look at him. I drove away. I didn't tell anybody nothing. I drove away. But yeah, so I went to the police station. I found somebody that wanted to sell me one used, and I wanted a handgun. And I went to the police station naively thinking I could fill out some forms or something. And the cop kind of laughed.
Didn't they?
No, I didn't have the gun with me. I knew not to get it. I knew I had to get paperwork. He just laughed at me like, you can't buy that. Like, to buy a gun in New Jersey, to buy that, it was a pistol. To buy a pistol in New Jersey, you have to apply for a firearms license, which allows you to buy ammunition and to apply. Wait for that to happen. You may or may not get that, but that's not too hard to get. Taking a class helps. You get the firearm license, then you select the gun that you want at a dealer. You apply for that serial number model gun, that gun. Then the dealer has to lock it up. Then you apply for that, has to go through this process. It could take months, like 4 months is not unusual.
Wow.
And they often deny it. That's to buy it. And then if they do allow it, then you can buy it, and you cannot carry it. If you get caught with that in the center console of your car, that's a 5-year mandatory, no discretion prison sentence.
Yikes.
If you had a pistol in your car, that's a legally owned pistol. That's New Jersey. So like, that's where I was living. Wow. Florida is like, you can be in a bar and a guy will casually mention he always carries his Glock. Florida is a totally different scene. And it's not more dangerous. It's actually less dangerous than New Jersey.
We forget that's the mixed bag. When you're frustrated with the feds and you say, well, what about states' rights? What about the state constitution? What about that? That's not a panacea. It doesn't necessarily fix all your problems. Right?
But you can move.
Is tyranny, no matter what level it
tyranny is, but you can move. And I did. I live in Florida now. So, back to your original point about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is a restriction on the federal government. Even though it doesn't say Congress shall make no law, that is what it's supposed to be. That's what it's meant. Reading the preamble to the Bill of Rights helps understand that. And like, they should have put Congress shall make no law there too.
Yeah, this is where the Supreme Court comes in with additional interpretation as well, though. Because the Supreme Court's going to step in and start saying things like, well, the 14th Amendment means that we can adopt certain federal rights and apply them to the states. And that was sort of necessary because you had a bunch of states that were not willing to extend citizenship or the rights of citizenship or all the same rights to all of their citizens. Because we had, our history of racism and slavery. And so the federal government was like, there's only one way to do this. We have to step in and we have to enforce it in a new way. And so there's this idea that certain, but maybe not all, but certain cases will say, yeah, the Bill of Rights applies to a state, whether the state likes it or not, through these other legal theories. But once again, it's not actually written in the text of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's not clear. I would have liked it if they made that that clear. So maybe that's a topic for another show. I didn't write this down as a question, but this whole incorporation doctrine thing, that the Bill of Rights is incorporated onto the state. So I've always, since I understood it,
frankly. I am.
You're in favor of it.
I think the founding fathers should have written it in expressly in the Constitution that anything that the federal government cannot infringe on that has to do with rights, the states can't infringe on either. That should have been in the Bill of Rights anyway, even if it wasn't in the original draft of the Constitution itself. As I would have said in the Bill of Rights that any rights that are held by the people, I would have maybe expanded Article 10 or something like that, where I would have said. Any of these things that the federal government can't do to people are these rights are held in the people and cannot be infringed by any level of government.
So you would have expanded the section in it's Article 10 where states are prohibited from certain things like making treaties, and you would put it in there.
I was thinking in the Bill of Rights.
Well, the bill. Okay, that's
10.
Messy.
In Amendment 10.
Amendment 10. Well, Amendment 10 just says that it's a power.
By the way, because anything that is not delegated to the federal government is held by the states or the people, that nothing that the federal government can't do to people that the states also cannot do to people. Probably, but.
Yeah, that would make I'll have to think about that one. My first reaction is that would ruin the 10th Amendment. But I'll have to think about that one. I don't want to start because you've thought about it, obviously. I know. I would push back.
Of religion. Under the 10th Amendment, the state could have established a state religion and forced everybody in Virginia to, well, here's a hilarious contradictory one. Everyone in Pennsylvania has to be Quaker.
You can't do that. If they did that, then they would not have any congressmen and no one could be president. Because the Constitution says no religious test of office shall ever be required for any office in the United States.
Well, but the question is that the federal government requirement or is that the state requirement? If you're not requiring the states to not make a test.
No, what I'm saying is that, and this is off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure this is correct, that if a state mandated that every person in that state be Quaker, then they couldn't have any congressmen or senators. It'd be unconstitutional because they made a religious test of office. So they would be saying there's a religious test of office to have an office under the United States, which say senator. They couldn't do it. That'd be my argument. I'm sticking to it.
Okay. Well, I would say that this is exactly the pitfall, is that the federal Constitution says there can be no test, but it doesn't say that the states can't make a test. It says the federal government can't make a test.
Oh, okay.
And that's the pitfall. We don't want to say the federal government can't do it because it's wrong, and then have somebody else do it on behalf of the federal government. Essentially.
I retract. I understand. Yes.
And that's a problem. We don't want that.
So because the religious test of office would be the federal government can't make a religious test of office.
Right.
In my view, the everything that has to do with rights, like the Bill of Rights, is a reminder of rights that the federal government's not allowed to infringe on. There really aren't rights in the Constitution. Like that's not what it's about.
They're not granted by it.
Well, no, there's no rights granted by any Constitution. That's morally impossible. Rights pre-exist constitutions, right? But the and not everybody understands that. Actually, I think most people don't understand it. But anyway,
that's the most important point for people to get out of any of this. Honestly.
I think all of my regular listeners understand that because they say it all the time. Hopefully, they understand it. Anyway, the Bill of Rights, I think, can only apply to the federal government. It's too messy. And secondly, as a practical matter, the Bill of Rights, I think it's actually my opinion, would have never been ratified if that was the argument, because the states would never have ratified amendments that limited themselves. That wasn't what it was about. The whole reason for the Bill of Rights was because people were concerned that the open language in the 1787 version of the Constitution would allow the federal government too much power, and they wanted to limit it better. It was never about limiting states.
Isn't that the great quandary of government, period? No one's going to give you the education needed to overthrow them. No one's going to give you the power to overthrow their power. There's a lust for power that is normal in humankind, and nobody wants to give you power over them. Your boss, even this is at every level of human interaction. Your boss at your job is not likely to put you in a position to take away his job. It's just the way that we think about it, right? And yet we have this problem. The founding fathers are looking at it, saying, "Well, we don't believe in the divine right of kings to have some kind of power that can't be deposed. We need to be able to depose a tyrant and start over and have some checks and balances, have some way to limit these powers of government so they don't get out of control." And that's the danger, right? The people might have the rights in theory, but unless we show that we're the ones in charge, nobody ever wants to give you the power to take away their power. It's against human nature.
Well, maybe the next show we have to do on anarcho-capitalism and argue why there should be no government at all. That'd be off the Constitution topic a little, but that's a fun one.
That's the thing that's hard for me, like ideologically speaking. I love having those arguments, and yet,
you're limited
and appreciating the rule of law in many aspects of life. It becomes really hard to figure out how to do that. Maybe it's like Justice Story said, laws are made for bad men. Good men need no laws.
Good men need no laws. So if you can split off a small enough group, but yeah, is it possible to arrange a society with 330 million people? That's a
right.
Anarcho-capitalism. I don't know.
What do you do about the bad men that will not be governed except by force?
Can society? It's an interesting topic, and I'm still in the limited government camp. So my political arrangement of society, like I talk about the Constitution, but and people might say, well, I'm pretty much a small L libertarian, sort of, but like that's the absolute max. Like never been part of the Libertarian Party. They're like big government fans, or have been until the Mises Caucus thing.
So you're saying the Libertarian Party isn't libertarian enough for you?
Oh, not even close. Like, because they're not libertarian. Well, but they changed, and so I want to make this clear. I'm talking about the last probably 10 years, but certainly the last 5 up until the Mises Caucus takeover in Reno. And I'm not a member of the Mises Caucus, but that's the first time I've actually seriously thought about joining the party. I've never been a member of any party ever in my life, and I'm not really ready to start at this point. But I like what they're doing. And, you listen to Dave Smith and Tom Woods and Andrew McArdle and Dennis Pratt, who was a delegate. I did a show with Dennis Pratt. He was one of the delegates there. But the Libertarian Party of the last 10 years has not been libertarian. They're kind of big government fans. So I'm on this, like, if you want to say it's a spectrum from like libertarian to anarchist, and my entire life I've been moving towards anarchist. Like libertarian is like the absolute maximum government I would ever want to live under. Right. If I had to decide. That's too much.
I'm a big fan of Mises because he was all an economic theorist about gold currency and about sound money. And so he's a big, that type of economics, the Austrian school of economics is a big thing for me. So yeah, I'm really excited that we've got more people talking about that in the Libertarian Party. But at the same time, our biggest problem as libertarians even is, once again, nobody wants to give you enough power to overthrow them, which is one of the reasons why there is a very concerted effort and a lot of laws in place and a lot of regulations in place to try to make sure that no third party will ever be viable. There's all kinds of institutional, structural roadblocks to ever allowing a third party to come to power. And one of the main reasons for that is the Libertarian Party. If the Libertarian Party ever had enough people to win an election, it would ruin the fun, because it would deprive them of power of the two major political parties. And so they'd much rather just juggle some power back and forth really gently and continue with their statist goals than they would be to allow a third party to come into power and actually deprive them of power. So
it's the uniparty view, right? And I look at the Republican and Democrat, the two mainstream parties, as they're basically on the same side. They do quibble over exactly where to dole out the money that they steal, and which
sure.
they don't even argue about which wars to fight anymore. They at least used to do that.
Right. At least you used to have at least some peaceful Democrats, some dove Democrats who are saying, no, we need to stop all the wars.
Even that's gone. Like,
pretty much, yeah.
Hillary was one of the biggest warmongers of the last half a dozen,
Right.
She was the Democratic candidate. Like, that doesn't make sense. And now you got Biden, who was in charge of Ukraine in 2014 as VP and helped orchestrate the coup. And now he's the president and he's a Democrat. Like, yeah, what happened to the 1960s, the Kennedy Democrats?
Yeah.
Kennedy would probably be a Republican now, right? Or he couldn't run. He'd be too much of a free market person to run as a Republican.
He would be a local raving lunatic right now, is what I think.
Yeah.
He'd be trying to get into the state house, and everybody'd be like, dude, you're not in touch. You're out of touch. And he wouldn't be able to get a state Senate seat or something.
Would have got to meet him. He probably would have been a Pork Fest. Maybe be in New Hampshire. He'd be a free stater, right? I don't know. But
See,
he could
moving
win.
to Florida isn't enough, man. Everybody should move to New Hampshire. Then we'll get a majority liberty-minded people, and we'll have a free state. So.
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, there's a couple issues with New Hampshire, but I do like New Hampshire. We spent a month. We spent a month there this year.
And I might be traveling a lot, and I'm in New Hampshire right now. But I mean, I am a resident of Utah, so I haven't really sprung for it either yet. But I'm always amused when I come to New Hampshire, and they're all like, "When are you moving to New Hampshire?"
When you move to New Hampshire, yeah. The argument from Utah is not quite as strong as, say, from New Jersey or Massachusetts.
Sure. Yeah.
Did you watch Jeremy Coffrin's "Stop Mass Immigration Now" video? I'll have to send you that. We should probably play that if Beverly could find that. No, I don't want to distract it. Anyway, Jeremy Kaufman is running for Senate. He's running for office in New Hampshire, and he's a free stater. He's also the guy who started Odyssey, competing with YouTube. So good guy. He did a video on mass immigration. It's Stop Mass Immigration Now, MASS. And he says, I went down to the border and I saw the huge immigration problem. All these people from Massachusetts are coming
over the border.
Yeah, stop mass immigration.
That's hilarious.
Funny. It's his campaign. It's a campaign video. It's hilarious. Anyway, yeah. I like New Hampshire. Yeah. I do happen to live with somebody who only saw snow briefly once in her life and is not inclined to see it again. So yeah, that's a little bit of a problem. But summertime in New Hampshire is nice. So we spent a month there. When we went to Pork Fest, we actually did it as a 2-month trip with a camper. We spent a month mostly in New Hampshire, in New England, but I like it.
Well, and the fall foliage right now is lovely.
Oh yeah, I would love to see it, but it's too cold there already. Do you have to wear long pants there? Actually, I was just in Montana for 3 weeks, so yeah, we wore long pants and stuff.
I'm used to wearing pants. That's what I usually wear pants. I don't even think about shorts.
Yeah, no, it's South Florida. All right, we're getting off topic, but yeah, I would consider it. Yeah. No, not you brought it up. It's really the topic as far as the civics aspect of this is that there's 50 states and the states are experiments, and New Hampshire's doing a great experiment right now. I'm 100% in favor. I'm not a free stater because I didn't move, but I gave 2 talks at Pork Fest this year, and one of them was Secession 101. Like, there's where I'm at. So I gave a secession talk to New Hampshire, mostly, half the people there were New Hampshire people, about why, and it was an intro. I did an intro to secession. It was arguments for and against. I did my best to do it balanced, although anybody watching could tell which side I was on. But I presented some of the arguments for and against, and basically argued why the arguments that it's legal and can be a good idea. My view on that, I'm all for Flexit, Texit.
This is and there's great arguments you can make even with liberals. The point is that association is voluntary. Relationships are voluntary, and any voluntary relationship, any consensual relationship, consent can be withdrawn at any time.
Yeah, that's the whole idea of that's the basic libertarian philosophical position, right?
And it's a libertarian position,
Voluntarist.
primarily in the sexual arena, but it's a libertarian position that is fairly well accepted by all sides right now in the world. And if you simply make that analogy and say, look, this is about consent, this is about consensual association, and consent can be withdrawn, then you can make a libertarian argument that very few people would argue against.
It's the reason, you know, I don't try to argue against New Jersey anymore. That if that's what the people of New Jersey choose to do, I don't live in New Jersey. And it is part of my position with the federal government, including on Bill of Rights or on, you know, like that New York. I've been arguing with people that New York case where they said, where the Supreme Court overturned the New York gun law. I'm like, no, that's a bad decision. I disagree with that. Supreme Court's wrong. They have no authority there. The Second Amendment limits what Congress can do, but it doesn't say New York can't restrict the right to keep and bear arms. I wouldn't argue anymore that, you know, New Jersey Constitution does not have a right to keep and bear arms. So New Jersey, I couldn't carry a gun in New Jersey, and for now I stay out of New Jersey. I know that when I travel through New Jersey, what I have to do, and what I can and can't bring, and what's required. I mean, I feel defenseless there, but I minimize my time there. That's what I do now. So I'm all for the 50 state experiment thing. So we'll have to get into that whole incorporation doctrine. Time is 2:00 Eastern. Oh, you're on Eastern time zone.
Sorry
now,
that we certainly went long. This has been a really great discussion. I've really appreciated it.
Yeah, I hope you'll come back and do this more. I could sit down and in 5 minutes write down enough for another hour show easy, because we only touched on a couple things. So
yeah,
I'll let you get back to selling real money, promoting real money in New Hampshire.
Yep.
Hold up a Goldback. You want to do a 1-minute Goldback intro for people that didn't?
Sure. For anybody who hasn't already caught it, Goldbacks, real gold money made out of 24-karat pure gold. Basically, a very thin coin. The basic idea is fairly simple. You don't have to worry about inflation if you have sound money. The Austrian School of Economics talks a lot about sound money. I recommend you go to goldback.com and learn a few things about it. But our basic experiment, our project, is now active in 4 states. We just launched Wyoming a little while ago. Huge success there. We signed up more than 50 businesses already to accept payment in Goldbacks right at the cash register, like any other kind of cash. And we've been selling them like mad, the new Wyoming Goldbacks. We stockpiled them for months and months to be sure that at launch we'd be able to meet demand. And yet we are just about completely out. And some of our distributors are completely out of some of those Wyoming Goldbacks already. But yeah, so 4 states, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming, those are contiguous. And then New Hampshire, all the way over here on the East Coast, all have this state local currency made out of gold. And yeah, I think that this speaks to the really important and larger point. Human rights are things that humans have. It's about what we can do. You can't wait around for the federal government to save you. You can't wait around for the Federal Reserve to decide to give you back your property rights. You have to just take direct action. And that's what we're doing. We're putting America back on the gold standard without the Fed, because we don't need the Fed. The states have the right to make gold and silver legal tender. So a bunch of states have already done so by their own state laws. And if you want to be back on the gold standard, you just don't have to wait for the Federal Reserve to do something. You can do something yourself. All you need to do is understand the problem. And in the solution for that problem, get some Goldbacks in your wallet and then spend them. And the moment you've spent a Goldback, you're on the gold standard.
It's a good idea. I love the idea. Oh, and by the way, everybody, there's a few in circulation here in Florida now.
Nice.
And we had one comment I have to read it to close this out, and we'll say goodbye. But G-Man pointed out a problem with my not traveling to New Jersey. He said, if you stay out of New Jersey because of their gun laws, then that affects interstate commerce.
Uh-oh.
I didn't think of that one. Very good.
You can't have that. I guess you gotta go to New Jersey with your guns and defy their laws.
And
it's good for interstate commerce.
Oh, and he was at PorcFest, by the way. I don't know if you met him. That was great. So thanks. I think this is the longest Rebel Civics have done. That was fascinating.
Well, I hope people made it to the end then. I sure had fun. So
some people made it to the end. All right, so we're going to sign off from now, and I'm going to see if I convince Benjamin to come back for another discussion.
Sure, anytime.
We got a few things that I want to thread through a little further. I definitely want to think through this thing about all weapons should be in the hands of people, not governments. That's an interesting one. That might be the title.
States, and then
that might be
only coordinated by the federal. So.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to get together with some people and upgrade my single engine private license to F-18. That would be fun. But I would need some help
handle the
for
G-forces.
fuel costs and stuff. Yeah, I would need some help. Okay. All right. Bye for now. Go ahead, Beverly. And if you want to, I was just going to say we'll chat after the credits.
Thanks for sticking around until the end. If you're new to Unsafe Space, check out our deep content library that includes discussions with everyone from James Lindsay to Brett Weinstein. And please consider helping to fund our work by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on a variety of social media platforms, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space Discord server, which is open to financial supporters at any level. We hope to see you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. It would be better for your health if you forgot what you just heard. That should be easy for someone of your intelligence. The following co-conspirators are hereby ordered to watch CNN. Experts agree that 87,000 new tax collectors will make inflation feel like less of a problem. I think we can agree that the FBI's track record speaks for itself. If you think about it, only government-sanctioned experts should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.